what I would, this is what I submitted to Ellen, and thank you for that kind introduction. You can read it. It's, when I teach presentation skills, the thing they tell you not to do is to read things that other people can read themselves. So this is what I originally wrote and what I thought I would do, but I have to tell you that in doing some research, I've discovered that my original intent has had to change, and I think that will become evident. Especially the notion of reform and transformation. What I'd also like to say is, please feel free to raise your hand or say something. Don't wait to the end if you don't want to. It doesn't bother me to be interrupted, and I have no problem, well, I hope I don't, going back to the train of thought I was on. So please feel free to either dispute what I'm saying or to maybe ask a question. So as I started putting this together, I thought somehow the notion of forms kept striking me. And the idea of transformation, to transform something, in contrast to reform. So I asked myself the question, which one applies more to Brentwood? And I asked this after I made some calls. I can't say I conducted interviews, but I called some well-known alumni. Leonard Tower is one, you might know the name. Bob Gallucci is another one. And I tracked them down where they live. And Bob Gallucci actually said, well, why do you think Brentwood's any different than any other place in Long Island, except for maybe something in the 19th century? And I said, well, because we're from there, I guess. I didn't have a really good answer. So I started thinking, maybe the idea of transformation is more important than the idea of reform, because my initial thought was, Brentwood and reform go together. So keep that thought in your head. Maybe that's more than one thought. Here are the reforms I'm going to talk about. You certainly know about many of these, but a few of these, maybe you don't know about some of the other ones.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned handicapped accessible school.
Yes, we're going to get to that. That's in. I put them down in the order I'm going to talk about them.
Okay.
So here's the first reform, and this comes from the book by a fellow named Roger Wunderlich. I don't know how you say it in English. Wunderlich in German, who actually is a Stony Brook grad, and he did a dissertation actually on modern times. This is our friend. Who is this? Some of you know. Some of you probably don't know. Game show host, soccer player, our friend Karl Marx. And that quote is from the German ideology, and it's Karl Marx's response to philosophy. In other words, we need to do something rather than just to talk about it or interpret it. And the reason I have Karl Marx, I say without Karl Marx, Brentwood might not exist in the form it is today. And you, as a historical society, would not be talking about some of the things you talk about and the school you want to rebuild, reconstruct, had it not been for Karl Marx. And why do I say that? Well, there they are. I say the original three. I was going to put Leonard Tower in there because he has a long beard and he looks kind of like Stephen Andrews and Karl Marx, but I said leave him alone. But Andrews is the first publisher of the Communist Manifesto in the United States, and he is one of the founders, as you know, of modern times. My contention is, if you today, or Brentwood today, or Brentwood of when I was growing up, if those characters showed up, you wouldn't let them in their meeting. You would call them names like they once called my father a communist in a board meeting because of the budget. I never could quite figure that one out, but it was the bad word back then. I don't know what it is now.
Still a bad word.
Okay. So, well, let's just go back very briefly. So the founding of Modern Times really is something that I know people look back on and they want to recreate parts of it. But I can assure you that most people that I know, I don't know a whole lot now, but when growing up here, would not want any part of what they would perceive as a communist settlement. Of course, Ambrose claimed to be an anarchist, but the line between that and, you know, Marx in the manifesto actually talked about government disappearing, and so, you know, some anarchists use that connection. Of course, there are many other ones. But so Brentwood's origins, at least Modern Times, you can go back to these guys who probably would not be in too many meetings nowadays. And they probably wouldn't have been teachers up until the Union, when the Union may have defended them. But before that, they wouldn't have been very, well, they may have been popular, but they wouldn't have been probably holding a job long. So Southeast Elementary, you asked the question. It was actually the first handicapped accessible school in, I believe, on the East Coast, at least in New York State. And some of these things I talked about in the very, I wrote in the very first slide. I'm integrating the personal with some of the other research I've done. And some of these things I just happen to know about because I grew up as an assistant to the superintendent. Not one that had anything to do with anything going on, but I heard everything that was happening. And, you know, in the days of regular phones, I couldn't help but listen to conversations. And you notice I have large ears. Well, I always had good hearing. So Eleanor Crosby was the principal of the school, and she had a, she was wheelchair bound. And so, and I know it was something that was of interest to the administration at the time, and something that they were proud that they actually had the first one in New York State. Curriculum reform. That was a significant item in the late 50s. I had another conversation with Dr. Swenson, Charlie Swenson, who happened to have been probably the English teacher of a few folks here, me included, who I have to tell you said I was a pain in some place, and another gentleman said the same thing. I wouldn't argue that. There's some other witnesses to that probably here too. But so the curriculum reform, though, was very significant. And you might recall Jeffrey Raskin, who was one of the main people behind the Macintosh computer. Well, he also went through the math program at Brentwood, as did a young guy here who is a physicist now, and I'm not sure he benefited from it, but let's just say he did.
He did. He did, especially benefited from Raskin, independent of the system.
See, well, so there were some other reforms, although that's maybe not a reform, but Boolean algebra was part of this. And don't ask me now, this is ancient stuff in my head, but I know because I always heard my father talking about Boolean algebra. I'll be quite honest, I'm not sure he knew exactly what it was, but he always talked about it. So it was one of those things that I was very curious about and did some, a little bit of research on later on. Structural linguistics, many of you who went through Brentwood, this was we were one of the first districts to do these things. And I consider that a reform. So it's something that, well, let me get to the next steps and you'll see the connection. Any questions on any of this? If you have a question on Boolean algebra, Mike Brill will be happy to answer any of them.
There were all kinds of flavors of new math. They had the continuum rods.
Yes.
They had the University of Maryland, the University of Illinois.
Ron Janice was one of the people. He actually, I saw his picture in that yearbook. He was a weightlifting and wrestling coach, but he was also one of the reformers in math. And Cuisenaire were the rods that were actually French, but they were used as manipulatives. And we were one of the first places, not the first place, to have that as well. So, but these were all curricular reforms. So you're right, absolutely. It's far more. That was the only image I could find. You know, so.
Yeah, but also, some of these were real mistakes, and they were abandoned after a single year, and we were the guinea pig.
Reform isn't necessarily good. You'll see that in a second. You're absolutely right. Having been in curriculum, I'm well aware of, but let me get to, that's a good, well, let me address it. Actually, yes, some of these things are mistakes, but what I find, especially as someone who's taught for a long time and has done work in other areas, and as any scientist will tell you, you hopefully learn from mistakes. In fact, would you argue that science is trying to, if you're right all the time, maybe you're doing something wrong, right, in research. So you actually can learn from mistakes. Whether Brentwood did or whether my father and the curriculum people did is the question can't answer right now. But they tried some reform. Sports reform. This may be something you say, well, who cares about that? Well, I happen to know, as an inside plant, that in 1966, the coaches had to resign. They were all released. A person named Wade Cummings was made athletic director, and they went out and hired people who then brought sports notoriety to Brentwood. One of them died recently. Both of them actually have died, Joe Campo and Stan Kellner. But they came because of the reform in sports. And I have to tell you, my father's original, he's the one who did it, his original major in college was Springfield College, and it was sports. So he had this sort of, this ongoing struggle between culture and sports won out usually, and as some people here know. So it's certainly not a great reform in terms of overall curriculum and things, but it certainly brought notoriety, positive notoriety. Alternative education, I'm not going to go talk about, you've probably heard enough about this, but actually I would hope you didn't hear enough about it, and I'm going to make some comments and some suggestions near the end of this presentation. This was a significant reform as well. From my understanding is 74 to 83 it existed, and now it obviously doesn't. And here's a reform from without. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this suit, but it was, well, you can read what it says. Has anyone here heard of it? Well, it was a long, you don't have to read this, but it was basically about bilingual education, which obviously in Brentwood at the time anyway, in the 70s, was bilingual education was an issue in lots of different places in the country. And so this suit came about, and the Brentwood district lost the suit. So they had to reform, but it wasn't a reform that they had planned on doing. So the transformations. I will contend that the transformations far outweigh the reforms. Pilgrim State. You can see at the bottom I did some research, and there was from Colonia to Community, I believe is the name, the study of Puerto Ricans in the United States. And you can see what it says, but the Pilgrim State caused the transformation in the community. The reason, one of the major reasons that the Hispanic community is so large now is basically because of these transformations. So it's something that you can actually see. As I drove through today, came a little early and looked around, it was sure evident that the Hispanic population is very large here. That's no mystery to anybody, right? This is sort of an aside. I don't know how many of you are aware of this film, but it was made at Pilgrim State. It was built at Mason General Hospital. It was produced by John Huston, and there was a series. Was anybody here aware of it at all? Well, it's an amazing. It's basically World War II. At the time, it wasn't called PTSD. The film was made in the 40s, right after World War II, and at Pilgrim. So John Huston and company came to Pilgrim, and it was not released till 1981 because they thought that it would be too strong emotionally for people to see. It's quite an amazing film. I highly recommend it. But it's part of Brentwood and part of a transformation directly connected to Pilgrim State. Transportation. It's probably not a mystery that two of the major arteries or two of the major forms of transportation caused a probably, well, not the big, but connected the biggest transformations. Certainly the Long Island Expressway, which started out, had all sorts of different names, and eventually became the 495. It was something else before the Queens Expressway, whatever. And in '63, it actually ended up coming out to Hauppauge, to, I believe, to Motor Parkway. It had a major effect on the population growth, which I believe I have some things on. The other is Entenmann's Bakery, which I find this also attracted a large Puerto Rican population. Of course, we all know that Entenmann's is in Bayshore, because nobody wants to live in Brentwood. But I've met people in other countries who were, and I know they said well, you grew up in Long Island, and they said, well, Bayshore, and they said the street. I said, Bayshore? What was the zip code? Well, it was 11. They were from Brentwood, but they said they were from Bayshore. And I said, well, look, and anyway, it was, whether it's humorous or not humorous, what they did. And what's the great irony of Entenmann's? Who owns Entenmann's now? Grupo Bimbo. I didn't realize it was a company. It's a Mexican company. It started out as German, got passed all over the place, and now it's owned by Spanish-speaking, by a conglomerate. So, I don't know, not a great irony, but it's sort of. The invasions, I call them. I couldn't think of anything else. The British invasion, of course, many of you remember that as the music and the long hair and people getting kicked out and the Beatles at school, which happened. Brentwood made the papers because they were suspended, like 30 people suspended for long hair, whatever, and shorts too. A mini suspension, more than. But the New England invasion. So what is the New England invasion? Well, let me just go a tiny bit into the personal history. I'm part of the New England invasion. My father was born in Vermont, my mother was born in Massachusetts, and my brother was born in Vermont. We all sort of made it down here. And I say living the superintendency, so I warned you in the beginning, there's a few personal stories in this. I used to go on recruiting trips with my father, and I'm sure, actually the thing I remember the most was cigarette smoke and hearing the clank of, my understanding is they actually conducted interviews sitting there having a bourbon or something or other. I don't think these days you would do that. Maybe I'm wrong. But they were in hotels in Boston, and I think some people in this audience actually were recruited up in that fashion, if I'm not mistaken. But I know a lot of people were, so I call it an invasion. I think I got my own personal reform bug growing up in Brentwood. And it's maybe too elaborate to go into, but I'm really convinced that seeing all the things that were happening, hearing about them, and being marginally involved in them, by the fact that I went to school. I say marginally because my heart wasn't really in school all the time. I got what I have to say is a reform bug. I strongly believe in reform, and I'm going to mention some other things at the end. So, and the travels that I took that were mentioned really confirmed a lot of the early feelings I had that I developed in Brentwood. And there's one in particular that I want to show you that I traveled, I worked in East Germany, I lived in Berlin, and my first, I didn't realize what I had seen. There was a candy store in Brentwood, right over by the railroad tracks. It's now a Hispanic, I don't know, whatever it is. It's some hair salon or something. But there used to be what we called a candy store. And I remember going in there once, and the man behind the counter, his sleeve went up, and I saw numbers on his arm. I don't know how old I was, 11, 12, 10. I didn't know what it was. I just sort of looked, and they pulled it down, and nothing was said. And it took me many, many years in Germany, they were images from either Auschwitz or one of the extermination camps. So something caught up with me that I recalled from my childhood here that was right around the corner, actually, over here, that I then realized suddenly what it was. the Soviet soldier, growing up here in what I call partially the age of reform, certainly the age of transformation. I didn't feel I wanted to bombard you with them, but they're really great videos. When I taught in Russia, I showed them to my students, the turtle that would always duck and cover. And when I finally saw a Soviet soldier, I was actually in the Army, in the U.S. Army. I was going from West Germany to West Berlin. And this guy came, and I was waiting for this sort of Olympic weightlifter person standing there banging his hand. And this guy about yay big, he looked like he was 16 years old. And he had a stubby pencil, like, you know, the old time, when you'd all sharpen it, so because you didn't have enough money, you buy another one, so about this big and you could barely write with it. He was scribbling this stuff on it. This is it? This is the Soviet Empire? This is what we say is going to do? It almost made me laugh. Well, it did make me laugh, but I didn't want to laugh at him because I didn't know what would happen. But it sort of brought home, so my travels brought home some of the things I'd learned going to school here that just didn't seem correct. So, however, here we go. There's Karl Marx, our friend. Remember, workers of all. That's the last line of the Communist Manifesto. And here's the quote about philosophers interpreting the world. And some Russian guy took my picture. Whoops. In front of it. So, just to prove that I was there. It's Highgate Cemetery. Marx is actually buried in London. So now let's go to a few other, the reform / transformation. This, as you can probably figure out, is my father. I don't know if you ever saw his hair like that. It's probably before he came here, because when he came here, he had some simple crew cut. Just so you can get an idea of what happened. Brentwood in 1954 had about 7,000 people. In 1970, maybe fewer. In 1970, or actually when my father left, so we were here the same amount of time, the same number of years, 13, as modern times existed. I have no idea if it's in the stars or something, but he stayed here till 67 and then moved to Washington. I had always imagined what a great student he must have been. What a wonderful, this person with this blah, blah, blah from Columbia University, he must have had, because he was always lecturing me about this. I want to show you a few things that will show you that the apple truly doesn't fall far from the tree. So this is what a resume looks like. His resume, the one he sent to Brentwood to get hired here. Notice the things you put on a resume here from Columbia University. Notice even, there's a few, the things they tell you never to do, leave a mistake there, well, there it is. They nonetheless got hired in Brentwood, probably because of that mistake. They figured, well, he's not perfect, so he could come here. You know, he was the first superintendent, the district principal of Brentwood. So, notice this, the guide, his dissertation, the guide to personal relations in the intermediate superintendency. So the idea of personal relations, that's what he brought to Brentwood, and that's why he wanted to, he had that, made a point of developing the school and doing the school reforms that he tried to do, some of which weren't smart, as Mike Grill pointed out, and he's absolutely correct. And I'm sure he would admit it, my father, if he could.
Failing fast is always the best thing.
That's right. Say that louder.
Failing fast is always the best strategy.
There we go. Just don't make it a long. This is from his high school yearbook. Notice all the other things here, and at the very bottom they couldn't think of anything else to do, so they said best all-around sport, which meant he didn't do a whole lot of anything. Here's his picture. Because you are big, it's no sign you are great. I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, but nonetheless. And notice it says they would bequeath a Model Ford to take the place of his fatigued gray mare. He spent much of his youth taking care of horses, which he hated with a passion, I must say. A certain way to get his blood boiling was to say how much he loved horses and how smart they were. But here's the best one. I'm not sure if it's possible to see this well. So here's the challenge. See which, if you can figure out which one is my father. But I won't torture you. So reputation based on where, what happened? We lost it here. Based on nonsense. This is your superintendent. Hobby, acting funny. Chief occupation, amusing others. Slang expressions, so's your old man. And his highest ambition was to drive a milk cart. So you kind of get the idea. This is the guy who brought reform to Brentwood, who came along, who brought the New Englanders down here, and who was, at the time, as he was superintendent, there were 24,000 students, incidentally. And as I think I said, it was the fastest growing community in the entire United States.
Yeah.
So it was, from all I could gather, not an easy job. And some of his kids made it even harder. So here's I'm not sure exactly how many, whether it was 6,000 or 7,000 or whatever, but the number, the percentage, incidentally, all of Suffolk County was one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing county in the country too. So Brentwood was just a part of that. But remember the transformations. These aren't reforms. No one sat down and planned this. Here's a sad fact about Brentwood. You probably know this from being here. And this connects to one of the things that I think that where we can institute some reform. Remember I said I was going to mention this. So this comes, I believe this is from 2009, from the 2005 New York Times. During the Iraq, one of the wars we've been involved with. So the present. Brentwood has the lowest. So history, I know this is the Historical Society. History's yesterday, right? And, so I got these pieces of information last week. Brentwood has, it has the lowest per capita income in Suffolk County that I could find. I looked at all the places that I know were fairly socioeconomically were lower, and Brentwood had a lower per capita income. It also has among the lowest, the 3 schools districts with the lowest test scores in the entire county. So my argument is, I don't believe it has to be that way, and I can assure you that my father wouldn't believe that either, or didn't believe that. So there's no board here, and I'm not running for office. I would never win anything. But I would maintain that there needs to be more reform. There needs to be another reform that can make this, at least the scores and at least what's happening in the schools, return to some point where I'm never sure that things were better, they were different. But I know that things can be made better with some reform. I know it because I've done it in different urban districts and other places as well. So here's the question, and I don't think our speakers were. And I'll leave you with a question. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering about the Maslow-Toffler experiment.
Yes.
Did that have any benefit to the test scores?
At the time, no one paid attention to the test scores. It's a current disease. Oh, sorry, issue. It's really Maslow-Toffler had probably as many or the most positive influence of any school reform in Brentwood history. But none of the people that I know about, and you can ask one of them maybe after we can talk about it, sat down and thought, well, we're here because of the test scores. I don't give a hoot. That's an expression my father always used to use. I don't really give a hoot about test scores. It's just a representation of, in some people's eyes, of progress. The Iraq War statistics, however, connect to all these things. Because if you look at the statistics of students who go to the military, which is fine. I mean, I was in the Army. It didn't ruin me. So was my father, my brother, and my son. What happens in a community like Brentwood is many of the students who have the talent, who could do something that they might want to do otherwise, don't have the opportunity, and they go to the military as a solution to something. And according to the facts of the Iraq War, more people from Brentwood High School died than any high school in the country. And so that's not, in my view, what a reform should focus on. Again, there's nothing wrong with serving in the military, but it shouldn't be seen as something, well, I can't do anything else, I'm going to do that. So, sir.
Steve, the only test scores that I'm familiar with from the Maslow-Toffler years were the reading scores. And the reading scores proved to be the highest in the district. We measured in the beginning of the year and again at the end of the year. And the increase in 1 year, on the average, was higher than any other place. And some youngsters specifically increased their reading scores by 4 years in that 1 year. So that's the only focus we had, was reading.
So
That's significant, right?
it is significant. There are other reforms. I'll just mention one very quickly. The bilingual, because I've done a study on this, and I've read some studies. The schools that start out, that are immersion language schools, where, for example, all instruction except for reading is done in the target language, Chinese, German, Spanish, whatever it is. They did a study in North Carolina of all those schools, and they were, the socioeconomic makeup of the school districts where these schools were, was that they were poorer than other parts of the state. And the students scored higher or the same as every other cohort group, no matter what their socioeconomic status. So it's absolutely clear that language, if it's done correctly, immersion language, can have a very positive effect. So there are things that could be done in places like Brentwood, and there are other programs that I know about that could be initiated, that would be reforms, that could have a similar effect to the Maslow-Toffler school and to these language programs. But in other words, there's clear research that shows what programs work and what don't. And it's, I believe, incumbent on people to do those things. And as Mike Brill wisely said, some things you try don't work, but at least try it. Don't just sit and say nothing can happen because they're this or they're that. That, to me, is the worst crime. So I have this short, I won't play it long. I want to leave you with a thought. Maybe, I hope we can have some conversation. If not, then we'll just have the rest of the donuts. They're probably gone. As to, is Brentwood, was transformation more important than reform? And Brentwood, as now a predominantly Spanish-speaking community, changed over the years. So did it change like a kaleidoscope? Does that change something that is a positive? Can something be gotten out of this change, out of the transformation, and can reform be reintroduced? So the speaker, somehow, I guess I didn't connect it properly. Well, I guess I made a mistake there. Hold on. Is it possible to hear that? No. So imagine over the years, Brentwood has transformed in this way. And here we are today. I won't torture you with playing that, but I hope, if you have some questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And yes,
Yeah,
Michael Brill.
I think that the whole idea of trying a bunch of things, about having a bunch of obstacles, is not such a bad paradigm for education. In other words, I thought that Cuisinart Continuo was the worst possible education. But we went from that immediately into Venusians teaching us a certain kind of math and Martians another. And all of this stuff was just a great opportunity for flexibility. And even the hard things were toughening, making you flexible, and you were dodging bullets all the time, and this was not a bad thing.
And don't forget, you're speaking to someone who just was probably born with some math manipulatives next to him, I'm sure, right? Of course not, but
Not at all.
math was not difficult for you ever.
Yes, there was 1 year, but it was quite different.
Ninth grade.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, but
He told me that
more
story.
more so than with you. The thing is that you know, there's this, what Buckminster Fuller would call the structural integrity of Brentwood. If you put a rope together and you make it out of different kinds of stuff as you go down the rope, and you tie a knot in the rope, and you push the knot down, it's still the same knot when it encounters different materials. I can think of no better analogy of this town as it's gone through its various transformations. Because this, so we can go back and celebrate the changes and the toughness that people had to do. I've seen some alumni and some teachers who, you know, they wear a badge of courage. So I think this is a good thing.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying anything is bad. I still, part of my heart, such as it is here. So I wouldn't come back otherwise. Yes, sir.
You know, I worked with Ronnie Janice and these people in the original Ford Foundation, and we got the grant directly with the help of Jerome Bruner up at Harvard. Is probably the main reason we got the grant. And that grant came in, Ford Foundation grant was $1 million a year for 3 years, each of 3 years. So it made a tremendous difference. I don't like the idea of transformation. I don't like the idea of reform. Reform seems to be that people want to throw out the old and start new. Transformation seems a continuation. But there's another word that Ronnie Janice pushed and Gene Hoyt pushed and demanded of all of us, and that was called innovation. And you're not going to survive today, tomorrow, unless you innovate. And it's taking what we know now and growing from it. And nothing that happened with the Ford Foundation back in the 60s was ever thrown out. We grew from every single part of that program. And that program is still going on today, and those innovations are still going on. Mike mentioned guys that we were involved with the University of Illinois, and Dave Page and these guys, and guys from Syracuse, and guys from Maryland. Were fantastic innovators. SMSG, School Mathematics Study Group. So all those innovations came along and all combined to make it happen. And it wouldn't have happened unless a key person was involved. And that key person that brought it all together was Gene Hoyt. Gene Hoyt was the one that identified Ronnie Janice. Ronnie Janice and Gene Hoyt were the two men that went to Harvard and spoke and tried to get a backing of a philosopher. And they did get the leading philosopher at the time, educational philosopher, Jerome Bruner, to support the program and therefore get the Ford Foundation grant. And it was the most innovative program, math program, and Jerome Bruner insisted that we not only innovate in math,
Right.
which was the original push, but
Yep.
it's going to be social studies, science, and English or language arts.
Yeah,
So
that's a
that
structural, right.
it had to be the first form of an interdisciplinary attack on that Ford Foundation grant.
Well, Jerome Bruner, thank you very much. You can tell a New England accent, right?
I was part of that rebel, that group that came down.
Are you a Red Sox or a Yankees fan?
I'm a Yankee hater. I'm a Red Sox fan.
Could we stop this whole thing right now?
Yeah.
So,
That's
actually,
Peter Demento, everybody.
And that's Pete
Pete
Demento, for those
Demento.
of you that don't know.
Jerome Bruner is still alive, and one of the things that I remember my father talking about Jerome Bruner. He's at now NYU. He was actually born in New York. He's a New Yorker, not a Bostonian. Taught at Oxford for a number of years, and one of the things he talked about in terms of cognition was the spiraling curriculum. He didn't believe that you had the mastery of one thing and spend all your time mastering this and moving on. He believed that you revisit things at different levels. So that's one of the things that was, I'm not sure if those words were used back then, but that's Jerome Bruner's claim. He's one of the most well-known cognitive psychologists, among the most well-known Americans for sure. The other one, John Dewey, is a Vermonter, but that's another story. So
What did your father always say about hiring good people?
his the quote that I remembered when I actually was hiring people too is, and I remember him saying, he said the best thing you can do as a principal or superintendent or someone hiring is to hire good people and get out of their way. And now I don't know if, exactly, that's what he said, I know what he meant. He actually meant provide them support, but don't stand there nitpicking and I have to tell you one quick story. When you hear about innovation, I remember one of the board members, and I remember all of them actually in different ways, but one of them actually came to the house because he lived near us. And I heard the conversations. Gene, yep. There's trouble at the high school. Okay, what's this? I was there today. Okay, there's papers all over the cafeteria. And he went, well, we'll take care of that. Or something. And then he sort of snickered because he heard me laughing. So there were forces that weren't always in favor of innovation of any sort, I can assure you. But yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about the film, Houston film.
Yes.
Is it available, and why was it controversial?
It's online. I actually watched it. It's 58 minutes long. Let There Be Light is the name of it. And it was made in 46, and I believe for a year or two. It was controversial because it showed servicemen who came back. It's what we now call PTSD, which originated as shell shock. Each war has changed the name of what it is, but the Mason General Hospital, which was a combination of Edgewood and 3 Pilgrim State buildings, was owned by the U.S. government and or procured by them to treat returning service people for psychological problems that they encountered in the war. And so the controversy was, I guess, showing that the men who went over and fought, and it was all men in the film, had these issues, these psychological issues. But I just stumbled on it. I mean, it's a fascinating film, really. It's not going to be in the movie theaters, but it's very, very, and you can clearly recognize Pilgrim. I mean, you can see that it's there. You can see the buildings and everything. And as you know, Mike Grill's father was the head of Pilgrim State, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct.
Right? Henry Grill, correct?
Yep.
So,
What was he?
Henry Grill, Dr. Henry Grill.
What was his positions?
He was the
Director.
He had various positions, but as far as the pinnacle in the Brentwood area was director of Pilgrim State Hospital.
Right, director.
So at the time, because Mike and I went to Russia and did some teaching, and I said it was the largest mental hospital. Mike said, but it was also the largest hospital in the world,
Yeah,
which I didn't know.
14,000 beds.
More, it said. It goes up, 16, 18, 14, I've seen all different numbers, but
14,000 as of 1959, and I didn't keep tabs after that.
Okay,
I didn't count the cots in the hall.
yeah, well, that's right. It said 16,000 or 17,000 in some of the things I've read, so that's a lot of people, as you know. Any other questions,
Are you
sir?
saying that Mason General Hospital was buildings 81, 82, and 83?
Correct, and Edgewood.
That was it.
Including it?
Yes.
Edgewood is what Mason became after they
Right.
the war.
Originally, it was 81, 82, and 83.
Originally, it was built as Mason General, and then it became Edgewood afterwards, as I
Right.
understand.
They took it. It was built by the U.S. government, and then it was taken and various things.
I'm a little confused. The Edgewood Hospital that was on Comac Road,
Yes.
all right,
That was Mason General,
that was Mason
and
General.
3 other buildings were Mason General. They were then sold, whatever. Became Pilgrim. 81, 2, and 3, I think. Any other questions? Incidentally, Innovation is a fascinating book by Peter Drucker, who you might know is actually an Austrian who studied with Schumpeter, the economist, but became the father of modern management theory. And he talked about innovation and entrepreneurship. And he would probably like those words better too. But anyway, any questions or comments or yes, sir.
You were relative of Hoyt,
No, when we were growing up, I always wanted to be because it seemed so big compared to where we were living. But the guy said, go away and leave us alone. No, we had nothing to do with it. And Hoyt, we weren't a relative of either. So, but you have to know, in parting, when we once went out to eat, we discovered the Long Island accent. I mean, my mother had a Bostonian accent for her whole life. And we were at this place, they called that a smorgasbord. It's basically all you can eat nowadays. And we were waiting in line, and people kept going in front of us, and and finally my father got annoyed, which he did sometimes, and went up to, what's so, I've been waiting here for half an hour, these people came in after me. He said, I already called your names. What do you mean? He says, I called Hurt. And he, what? So we found out. Pardon?
Sanderling always called him Kurt.
That's right. If you were from Brooklyn, that's what you said. Anyway, I thank you very, very much. It'd be fun to see you again.